There are two types of truly bad films. One that's so bad it's bad, and the other that's so bad it's good. Somehow, this is both. Hey guys, I'm Jax, and this is my spoiler-free review for the new film, In the Lost Lands. The newest film by Paul W.S. Anderson. And of course, when it comes to everybody's second to ninth favorite Mr. Anderson, there is a contractual obligation, or maybe it's just love, or maybe it's just laziness, or maybe it's some kind of secret blackmail situation. Whatever the situation is, his wife, Mila Jovovich, is back, playing the character she plays in every movie. Stoic, badass warrior who's actually super badass, but is just very cold and emotionless. And you're like, is that a choice from the actor, or is that just as much emotion she can give? I'm not trying to throw shade. I think she's kind of good. Not in this, but sometimes she's good. And so this time around, the stoic badass warrior is also a witch. And she has to team up with Dave Bautista, who plays some kind of cool gun-slinging cowboy man. He hunts monsters, and she's like, I need you to help me hunt some monsters. And then they go and try and kill a werewolf. I don't know what you're thinking. What? That's what this movie's about? That sounds awesome. Yes, it sounds awesome. It's not. To kill that werewolf, they have to travel into the Lost Lands. Now, what are these Lost Lands? Well, imagine the most generic CGI post-apocalyptic landscape you've ever seen, then make it yellow. But not like a nice yellow. Picture the most disgusting, ugly yellow you can possibly fathom in your mind, and then apply it to the entire film. And just for a little bit of spice onto that, add some brown. But once again, a very disgusting, ugly brown. This film is a bizarre throwback to early 2000s entirely green screen films like your Sin Cities and 300s, but worse in every single way, and with a newfound sense of the phrase, endless ugly voids of nothingness. It is wild to me in a post-volume Hollywood that they can still make films using all this modern technology and give me such strong early 2000s straight-to-DVD vibes. Unfortunately, it lacks the visual awe and creativity of all of those films that did inspire it, that made those early 2000s films really pop and were really stylistic and really interesting. Now it just kind of feels very cheap and lazy and uninspired, unfortunately. At times, you can kind of think there was a plan at one point, but there are so many moments here that I'll get to vaguely that just kind of show that this wasn't really like a truly aesthetic choice like a Sin City or a 300. It just feels like though this was the simplest, easiest, and cheapest way to do it, so that's why they did it. Now, it sounds like I didn't like this, which I didn't, but I didn't hate it as much as I thought I would. The film is oddly charming for a film with no charm. One positive, I was never bored. I was morbidly curious to see what kind of new madness I was going to experience, what kind of insane plot point or baffling visual or just shockingly bad acting was coming next. The film kept me on my toes in quite an entertaining way, and that does sound very rude and condescending, but I don't know, I did get a lot of enjoyment from just how baffled I was from so many decisions from like the creative team to just like story points and just things that happened were quite entertaining. So like, I don't know, some films bore you and that's like, they're not bad, they're just boring and dull. This was never boring. And there are some twists and turns and reveals and revelations in the third act that I think had I cared on any emotional level about any of the characters or ideas, that when those third act twists come, I would have been blown away. I would have been like, wow, that is crazy and awesome. Regardless of the actual execution, the basic premise and plot of this film is really awesome. It's based off a short story by George R.R. Martin, and despite the fact that it does actually have an end, you can totally tell he wrote it. I do love madness, weird, high fantasy concepts, and this film has them in spades. We've got witches, we've got werewolves, we've got gunslingers. The vibe of this film, as well as its lore and mythology, is really interesting. It's this bizarre mix of high fantasy mixed with some kind of budget Mad Max situation, and I kind of liked all of that, despite the visuals and the fact that it never really lived up to the potential of this premise. Another big issue with this film is that it sounds really cool, awesome, and amazing and fun, but the film itself is not having fun. You, as an audience, might have fun watching it, but the film itself is not having fun. It is deadly serious to a fault, and it just kind of doesn't blend with the things you're actually seeing. There feels like there needs to be a bit of fun, light-heartedness to it. We don't need an MCU style wink and a nod to the camera, but like a single joke in the film would have gone a long way. There are moments in this film that I laughed at the film, and I laughed at how stupid and ridiculous things were, but I wouldn't really consider that that's the film having fun. It's more like the film thought it was being really, really cool or awesome, but it was being really, really dumb, and that was funny. It wasn't being funny. Like at one point, Dave Bautista fights a guy who has a gun, and Dave Bautista throws a snake at him, and at the end of the fight, he acts like the guy was using some kind of primitive weapon in a gun, and he's acting like Obi-Wan. He's all like, so uncivilized, and it's like, bro, you brought a snake to a gunfight. Why is this scene so serious? It's a baffling movie, and honestly, there are moments like that that do make it fun. As I said, it's so bad, it is good, and there are lots of moments like that in the film, but overall, I am kind of still disappointed because I feel like it would be even funner if they had made it that intentionally. Every character, and I hate to say it, actor in this film is devoid of charisma. They are all absolutely atrocious, and it really, really hurts to watch. You kind of never know what you're going to get though, so it is kind of exciting in its own really weird way. Because sometimes you might get the driest, least sexual pillow talk you've ever seen from the flattest, most dull dialogue you've ever seen with the flattest, dullest performances you've ever seen. And then the next scene, everyone is acting like a cartoonish, mustache-twirling villain screaming at the top of their lungs as they try and run somebody over with a train. Like it goes up and down like a crazy roller coaster from the dullest performances to the most absurdly insane performances. And honestly, scene to scene, you just don't know what you're gonna get. And that is fun. On the action, I do think that maybe like if you like this type of action, it is serviceable. But for me, I did find it kind of just very generic and samey, and it was just kind of quite lackluster and unimaginative, which I just felt was quite disappointing. Overall, this film is absolutely terrible, and maybe you'll have a bit of fun laughing at the film, but it is absolutely not worth your money. They spent an outrageous sum of money on this movie, and they took every corner to make it as cheap and ugly and pathetic as possible. For instance, the entire film is our two leads traveling from video game cutscene action set piece to another, and they just walk into a room, but they just walk into the same green screen room, and they just CGI it different later and go, wow, we're in a different location now. And the only reason you know they're in a different location each time is because spliced between these scenes is an extreme close-up of Dave Bautista or Mila Jovovich, and they just go, wow, the snake pit of Fire Doom was crazy. And now we're off to Bonebreaker Bridge. Hope there's no magic witches that can fight my magic witch powers. And it's just an extreme close-up, and then it just cuts to the next scene, and they walk in and they go, well, it sucks that there are magic witch ladies here to fight my magic. And then the scene just like picks up, and it's baffling and crazy. And if this was like a student film made for like $35, you'd be like, that was actually really clever how like we know from that one wide that they're on horses, but each time it cut between the different giant set pieces, you were just on an extreme close-up. And so the background, you can just kind of do whatever. It's just out of focus nothingness, and the whole film looks yellow, so they can all look the same. And you clearly shot that all on one day, probably in like 35 minutes, just a close-up on each actor. They just spout a bunch of gibberish nonsense. It barely has to be coherent. That was a really clever way on $35 for your entire film to splice between the action set pieces. But for a real movie, by a real director who's made real movies, kind of cheap, kind of embarrassing, kind of the most pathetic thing, but on the other hand, I kind of respect that he took the most lazy option and was just like, I'm just having fun with my wife in a green room.